It's good to see you. I was fascinated when I first found out that Adam had worked for NASA, because the history of NASA and the space program, and aviation in general, but especially the space program, is fascinating to me and one of my favorite topics to talk about. Because there are parts of that that are very, very difficult to comprehend. An aircraft that looks like a building, a 30-story building that weighs 3,000 tons, is going to fly. That's kind of hard to wrap your brain around. The 4 big F-1 engines that made up the first stage of the Saturn V rocket, when it lit off, those engines ate 15 tons of fuel per second. That's hard to wrap your brain around. All kinds of things about the space program are like that. And that they did it with less computer power than your car, okay? Much less computer power than your car. And how they did it, and I'm just a huge fan and fascinated by it. But I have to break it down into pieces. I have to talk about or think about the engine technology and how they developed it and the problems, or the guidance package, or the lander, or the development of the first computers and things like this. You have to think about it somewhat in chunks, because the whole project is really difficult to wrap your brain around. In some ways, the challenge that we have when we are confronted with the idea of God becoming man, living his life, sacrificing himself for us, the third day guaranteeing our hope by the resurrection. Those are hard, difficult, challenging concepts. And it is a lifetime of struggle. It is a lifetime of effort to combine these things and to make them into a whole, and to step back and see the glory of God and the love of God and the mercy of God and the patience of God and so many other things, to understand these images. Now, the wonderful thing is that God has assisted us by breaking some of these concepts down into ideas that we can more easily, for lack of a better term, digest. Because there is a number of images, a number of stories, a number of events that are illustrative of what Jesus did. Case in point, Abraham offering Isaac. We see the connection. We make the connection. When we study the challenge of offering a son on behalf of the will of God, we get some idea about what it takes. The Passover, probably the one that's discussed the most. The Passover, because Jesus takes the elements from the Passover feast that he celebrated just before going to the garden. He takes a couple of those elements that are there and gives us the direct command. Take, eat. This is my body in remembrance. Drink. This is my blood. But the Passover helps us understand that he is passing over the people just before they left Egypt, the celebration that continued. We make that connection. We talked about the passage, the idea of both the high priest and the sacrifice being embodied in Jesus himself. But it helps that we know about the Day of Atonement. and we can picture those things. Help us learn about the sacrifice of Jesus. But we do it in pieces. Let's talk about one other piece, probably the one that gets discussed the least in many ways, is the story of Jonah. Now, what do you know about the story of Jonah? You got a fish. And the fish, there's my friends that when we used to go fishing a great deal, if we didn't catch anything, we would just call ourselves for the rest of the day Jonah, because the fish got us, not we got the fish. But here is, this story is actually unique in so many ways, both in terms of the connection to the story of Jesus, but also the connection to the prophets themselves. And let's see if I can point out a couple of those. One of them is the reaction of Jonah when he is first called. God tells him, go east. He goes west. He says, go to Nineveh. He's going as fast as he can in the opposite direction. And of course, he ends up in this ship, the storm. The sailors that recognize that there's something going on here, and he finally, in that chapter 1, explains, yes, I'm running from God, throw me in the sea. That's fascinating. But that's the story, that's kind of about the level we tell the kids. Not the frustration and the fear of what Jonah is being called to do. He's being called to preach to the most powerful military empire in the known world at the time. The city of Nineveh was enormous. It says later on in Jonah that it took 3 days to walk around it. It mentions that there is at least 150,000 people in the city. And they are the enemies of almost every nation around them, and later on in a generation or two, they're going to come and destroy the northern tribes. They are the enemy. And God is telling Jonah, go preach to those folks. Or they're going to be destroyed. And he goes, that's not a bad idea. And he goes the other way. But of course, he gets taught a very powerful lesson. Swallowed by a fish. Don't know what kind of fish. Never caught one that big. But big fish. And this sounds like, almost like a Aesop's fable or a Greek myth or something like that. And it would be easy at some point in time maybe to pass it off in our own minds as something, well, it's just fantastic, and this is some kind of, until Jesus references it about himself, and that's what we're going to be looking at. He says that's real. That really happened. And I can tell you a couple of other reasons why I know it happened. One of them being, by the time you get to chapter 3, chapter 2 is a prayer. He pleads with God. I'm in a fish. I'm in trouble. I've done wrong. Please, I need rescue. And at the end of chapter 2, the fish, in New American Standard, in one of those graphic kind of images, the fish vomits him out onto the beach. And then we pick up the story in chapter 3. And he gets the exact same instructions he got before. Arise, go to Nineveh, the great city, and proclaim to it the proclamation which I am going to tell you. This is what the prophets did. They spoke the word of God. So Jonah arose and went to Nineveh, according to the word of the Lord. Now Nineveh was an exceedingly great city, 3 days' walk. This is a big place. By the way, you can still see the walls of Nineveh. Pull up Google Earth sometime. Look for the city of Mosul, or as they say on CNN, Mosul. And you can still see the outlines of this enormous place. The walls are still visible. And he goes to this place, and Jonah began to go through the city 1 day's walk, and he cried out and said, "Yet 40 days, and Nineveh will be overthrown." If you ever want to memorize one of the prophetic messages that's found in the Scriptures, the entirety of the proclamation of Jonah, there it is. That's all it is. Yet 40 days and Nineveh will be overthrown. That's the entirety of his message. Another interesting thing about Jonah, he's got the shortest repertoire there is. But there's something else about it. Verse 5. When the people of Nineveh believed, then the people of Nineveh believed in God, and they called a fast and put on sackcloth from the greatest to the least. And the story in chapter 3 continues on to reaching the king and his response to that, which is to do this in an official way, and everyone is impacted by this, including himself. And I'm missing something here, aren't I? There's something kind of off-kilter about this, because it's a one-line message. Yet 40 days, and Nineveh will be overthrown. And yet, he impacted everybody in the city. Everybody. Including the king. I'm missing something. How can that be? I've only come to one conclusion. How could Jonah be that effective? And the answer to that question, I believe, everybody knew about the fish. Everybody had heard the story about this man vomited up on the beach by this big fish. And he said, "Going to Nineveh, and I've got to preach to the people." And everybody knew 3 days in the fish. This is the guy that has come to our city, and he has a message for us. 40 days, and we'll be overthrown. We've got to do something. He had the credibility of the story of what happened to him. People listened. I'm going to date myself here. Many years ago, I was sitting in chapel in Florida College. And if you're a student during that time, chapel started and you listened to the message and it was good most of the time. And then they did these announcements. And they'd have this list and you know, what announcements for all the students and blah, blah, blah. And then the worst thing you could possibly hear is, today we have a special guest speaker that's going to be talking to the students, and you start sliding down your seat. Oh, we're not going to get out of chapel for 45 minutes. This is going to be horrible, okay? And that's pretty much the reaction of everybody. Because it's going to be some guy that's going to talk about him being at school 30 years ago and how he knew, I'm dating myself, Jim Cope and all this other thing. And Collie Caldwell, sneaky little dude he is, he did exactly that. He got up there and he pulled he's got his piece of paper, and he reads on it, and he says, yeah, well, we've got all these announcements, and we have a special guest speaker, and his name, and who I don't remember his name anymore, but he lived in the Tampa area, and he decided when he was 18 to go into the Air Force, and he served in the Air Force, and for the past 444 days, he had been a hostage of the Iranian government. I'd like to introduce you to this gentleman. It was one of the Iranian hostages that had been held for a year and a half, and it almost sent the whole world to war. We had heard about these 52 hostages. And as he gets to that part about, yes, he was one of the 52 hostages, everybody in the whole place sat up straight to listen. Because this was somebody that had a story to tell, had something that I wanted to hear. I don't remember a word of it now. I just want you to know. But that I did get a chance to meet one of those 52 men that had been held hostage is a point of pride. This is the kind of ethos that Jonah walked into Nineveh with and says, 40 days, that's your window. And the whole city responded. 3 days in the belly of the fish. And yet he's alive. And even an adulterous generation craves for a sign, and yet no sign will be given to it but the sign of Jonah the prophet. For just as Jonah was there 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the sea monster, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The men of Nineveh stood up, will stand up with this generation on the judgment, and will condemn it because they repented at the preaching of Jonah. And behold, something greater than Jonah is here. We understand the impact of the story because of the story of Jonah. And Jesus says, look at what Nineveh did. What will you do? Because the Son of Man will arise in a similar way. Will you believe? From Acts 17. Paul's address at Mars Hill. As he looks at those Greek philosophers and people that wanted to hear something new and never heard anything like this, he ends the message with this statement. Therefore, having overlooked the times of ignorance, God is now declaring to men that all people everywhere should repent, because he has fixed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness through a man whom he has appointed, having furnished proof. When you hear that, I want you to think about first Jonah and now Jesus. Having furnished proof to all men by raising him from the dead. When we celebrate the Lord's Supper, this story that has been told to us in pieces to help us understand, completely fulfilled, magnificently executed, wonderfully conceived, that we share. Ladies and gentlemen, we're in Nineveh. We're in Jerusalem. We're in Athens. Because the stories are there for us. And we celebrate, yes, God raised Jesus. The sacrifice that means so much to us. And we celebrate.